Hassan. I'm a researcher at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Study. It is my honor to facilitate the last session of the first day of the annual Palestine Forum. The session is entitled War on Gaza. And the duty of supporting Palestine. We will have 4 speakers on this panel. Dr. Adham Saouli, Dr. Mehran Kamrava, Dr. Ali Muhammad Dahab, and Dr. Marwan Kabalan. Obviously, this session is important, and we will have a variety of topics. The main question, perhaps, that we can ask is how the support fronts will support the situation in Gaza and supporting the resistance in Gaza or relieving the pressure in Gaza. The transformations that we have seen in the last year, very few people predicted them. The assassination of the historic leader of Hezbollah, Mr. Hassan Nasrallah, and his succession, the leader in succession was also assassinated, and the new power balances in Lebanon that produced a government seems like it's the beginning of a new order in Lebanon with the election of a new president and a new Prime Minister. Also in Syria, Al-Assad regime collapsed and a new political administration has begun in Syria. The situation really poses lots of questions in Yemen. It seems that the Yemeni front will escalate in the new year with the Trump the administration. They have categorized the Houthis as terrorists once more. And the new Secretary of State in the U.S. Contacted the Yemeni government as a type of a new thought or new way of thought, a new methodology to deal with Yemen in Iran. It seems that the regime for the first time is in a state of self-defense and awaiting the formalization of the new policy of Trump's administration. Each speaker will speak for 15 minutes, 15 to 18 minutes perhaps. We will start with Dr. Adham Saouli. He is a professor of political sciences and international relations at the Doha Institute and the professor of international relations at the University of St. Andrews. He is interested in comparative politics and international relations, specifically in the MENA region. His research focuses on the formation of the state politics and the relationships in the Middle East and social movements. His publications include his book, The Arab State, the State Formation. Please go ahead. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Since we don't have lots of time, so I will start right away with my topic without any introduction. The goals of my research paper that I am presenting here in this conference focus on understanding the causes and the results of the entrance of Hezbollah into the war, the Gaza war on the 8th of October, that started on the 8th of October 2023. It is obvious from the title is that the results for Hezbollah were not desired, were unwanted. Of course, they had some results in mind. However, the conflict dynamics, quite often lead to undesired effects. So my main argument that I build on in my presentation and the questions that I answered is that honestly, Hezbollah was suffering from gaps, strategic gaps, since before he entered the Gaza war. things may seem as if they have received, and of course they have received a big blow by September 2024. However, quite honestly, the origins of these repercussions go back years in the past, and in these last few months, we have witnessed quick and accelerating events that may seem to observers as a surprise. But honestly, if you go deeper, historically deeper into the issue, it might not be so shocking to you. Uh, First, the causes that led Hezbollah to enter the war. I have prepared a study about this, so I'll try to be concise to give you a summary about that and then move on to the strategic gaps. The entrance of Hezbollah in the war in 2023, honestly, Hezbollah, we know now that they were surprised by the operation done by Hamas, and they were in a state at several levels that was a critical state of concern. What should I do as a movement, as an Islamic movement, as a resistance movement, after one of my allies carried out an attack in the region, especially that Hamas, with the speech of Mohammed Deif, asked his allies, their allies in the region, to directly interfere in the war at the time. And so the unification of fronts was a part of the discourse of Hezbollah. However, that was one of the strategic gaps. There was no clarity about this concept. What did it mean? What does it mean to have unification of fronts? And I believe, this is an answer before I move on, it is a project. It is an aspiration, a wish, and it was not something that was concrete or clear. Hezbollah faced a huge issue related to the essence of its persona and its existence as a resistance movement, what we call in literature the ontology of Hezbollah, or their reality, their real existence. And so they were concerned for their ontological existence. If they had not interfered, it would have affected their identity, reputation, culture. It would have had huge repercussions, and they might turn into, between quotation marks, other regimes in the region which never take action in any conflict, specifically in the Arab-Israeli conflict. However, if they had interfered, they would have threatened their physical security. Why? Because, as you know, after the Al-Aqsa flood operation, Israel went into a hysterical state, a severe attack, and it was incredibly difficult to control the Israeli behavior. And so Hezbollah was concerned. What did Hezbollah do? Vis-a-vis this strategic dilemma, they attempted to do the minimum, what they believed as the minimum level, and what I call as a constrained war. They opened a front, but they did not open a comprehensive front. They only opened one front to preserve their identity and to stay in solidarity with the Hamas movement. What are the constraints? Hezbollah faced many constraints that constrained their movement, their action, making them very cautious. First, they didn't know the intents and purposes of Israel after the 7th of October, so they were quite concerned. And then we found out that Israel was preparing for the attack against Hezbollah. And we remind you here that they considered Hezbollah the biggest danger, the biggest threat in the region after Iran. And there was great concern about direct interference by the US, as you know. US moved some military sectors and threatened Hezbollah not to interfere. And third, the regional reality. The regional reality, as you know, is not opportune, is not suitable for wars. If you are to study the situation with a cool mind, the situation cannot tolerate wars due to things that I will address, and these are parts of the strategic gaps that Hezbollah faced, and comprehensive opposition in the Lebanese inside. All political parties that were allies to Hezbollah were against entering the war, and thus they opened or started a war that they thought where they thought they could strike that balance, and they thought that they could preserve what they thought was the rules of engagement. Of course, the rules of engagement were highlighted quite a lot by Hezbollah, but Israel didn't really talk about it. And here we ask the questions: rules of engagement for whom, and for what reasons, and for what results? In general, this situation lasted for a long time until Israel surprised or took Hezbollah by surprise in September 2024. Within 10 days, that were very important. Hezbollah was taken by surprise, and they've taken a very strong blow. Since 17th September 2024, they were under the attack of the explosion of pagers, and then the next day, the walkie-talkies explosions happened, which led to the assassination of 39 persons. In the 20th of September. The elite group or Radwan force was bombed, Ibrahim Aqil included. On the 23rd of September, the south of Lebanon and Al-Baqa received 2,000 Israeli airstrikes, and Israel destroyed, we don't know the accurate numbers, but between 50 to 80% of the properties or the things that Hezbollah owned until the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, and so the pagers were just the beginning of that war. So why was Hezbollah taken by surprise? I believe that Israel sent many signals to Hezbollah in the last year, starting with the conflict on the Lebanese-Israeli borders, assassinations of leaders, and it was obvious by these assassinations that there were gaps in Hezbollah. And in 2024, they sent a message by assassinating Salah al-Arouri in the southern part of Lebanon. I'm not, of course, a military tactician, but it was obvious that there were high-level tactics in this assassination operation. And then they assassinated Fuad Shukr, who is the highest-ranking military leader in Hezbollah. These were main signals. And then Israel sent many political signals and set two goals or two conditions for Hezbollah to adhere by if they are to end the war: to withdraw into Al-Litani River and then sever the ties with Gaza. Hezbollah, for many reasons that we don't have the time to explain, did not approve these conditions, and they continued until the big attack came in these 10 days in September, and it opened an all-out war at the time that remained until the 23rd of November, and now we are living the last days of that, but we never know what could happen afterwards. So is it that in 10 days, or let us say in 1 year, a party that looked very strong and was a pillar of resistance in the region, how did they receive this strike or this blow? We can analyze this phenomenon in these days by looking into these days, that there were hacks and that started since 2006. Since the end of the 2006 war, Israel started preparing for this war. We can mention that, but I would like to highlight other things that led Hezbollah to what I call their them perishing or collapsing. Perhaps I'll elaborate on that during the Q&As because I don't have time right now. However, I believe that there are 3 or 4 main factors for understanding what I call the strategic gaps in Hezbollah. And quite honestly, it shouldn't come as a surprise, but sometimes the ideology can blind you blind you or block you from understanding the world. First, the perception, the discourse, and the pride in the discourse itself. Hezbollah relied on certain successes, but the discourse sometimes plays a role in. And it's not just about communication with the audience or with allies or with enemies. Discourse, over time, discourse forms the world in which we live. And so, when Hezbollah stopped the Israeli goals in 2006, to a great extent, that was a huge accomplishment. Hezbollah considered it victory, a divine victory that had a religious dimension. With time, this type of language creates expectations and a certain perception of the world and forms our perception of the world and our understanding of the world. And that is very important. And sometimes discourse turns into an ambush that people fall into. And Hezbollah was not the first to fall into this ambush, such as the Nasserism, which experienced the same thing. There is a deeper dimension to that, and this is where Hezbollah perished. Hezbollah set for themselves very, very huge goals, regardless of your political stance or your ethical stance on their ideology. They set very high-level goals, including the liberation of Palestine and liberation from imperialism in the region, because they are an extension of the Islamic revolution. And at the religious level, they consider themselves pious men that prepare the way for the day of judgment. So it's really deep on the ideological level. So in my opinion, these aspirations are very big for a party that, no matter how big this party is, it's still small in these big in these big conflicts in a country that has political fragmentations. Even with this political incubator in the Amal movement, it is different. They have a different perception of Lebanon and the Israeli-Arab conflict, and they have clashed in the 80s. I believe these goals were quite large, and given these large goals, they made Hezbollah dive into far too complicated conflicts in the region, including their entrance into Syria. Their entrance was problematic at several levels in terms of politics, in terms of concepts, strategies, and ethics. And also their entrance into Yemen, which led to conflicts with regimes in the Gulf and in the Arab world. In other words, indulging into the political muds of the Middle East is quite risky. And again, Hezbollah is not the first to do that. I believe the Liberation Organization went into conflicts in Jordan and Lebanon, Jamal Abdel Nasser in Yemen, and in other countries. So the price for playing this role or building this pillar is really, really high and strategic. So, in my opinion, this is a main gap, these goals and the attempt to achieve them. There are other reasons that include, for example, the technological and military superiority of the Israeli army at a time where Hezbollah was working to instill themselves and to prepare for a future war with Israel. The Israelis were preparing for this war as well since the first moment without a discourse, even though they had the ability to have a discourse, but they didn't use that. Hezbollah used that discourse and it was an ambush. It led to undesired results. And this brought us to the moment of the exam, the moment of the testing moment where Hezbollah was constrained. Let us start with the region. Iran, which will be addressed by my colleague Dr. Mehran, who knows better about that. But Iran was hesitant. It didn't want to fall into the ambush of the war with Israel. Hezbollah also was hesitant. And they were hesitant due to the reasons that I mentioned, the domestic situation of Lebanon and other reasons, and the situation of Syria, that Hezbollah kept the situation going. It was a destroyed country occupied by various parties. The regime didn't want to fight, and there was no possibility of fighting, and so it was incapacitated. And so Gaza, of course, the situation in Gaza was over. The situation in Gaza was over, and the question was, why did this war last so long? We're asking, can Israel answer the question, why did they continue this far? It's because Netanyahu finished his conflicts with the others and then came back to Gaza. If he had finished them, he would have stopped in Lebanon as well. So the entrance of Hezbollah into this conflict extended the war of Gaza for long months. So, at the end of the day, Hezbollah was constrained even at the military level. The Israeli military abilities are far superior, and we've seen that live in this war. Israel was able to incapacitate Hezbollah in terms of destroying infrastructure and also targeting civilians. And Israel continued by saying that they would avoid targeting civilians, but thousands of civilians were martyred in this war in Lebanon. Hezbollah was not able to reach civilians because this would have meant more comprehensive strikes against Lebanon. So Hezbollah was in a war that led to its perishing. They would not have been able to go into this war. And the last sentence I would like to say here, which was a main gap, Hezbollah's engagement in Lebanon and in the region led to undesired results. They lost many allies. The region became the region it fell out of favor of the other parties in the region. and Hezbollah was a mid-range armed group. They had limited horizons, and their ideological perception constrained their political maneuvering ability. And so they did not take a step back when they should have taken a step back, and so they paid the price for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Adham, for this important intervention. There is a central question: has the axis of resistance ended? Is it dead and buried now? I think our interventions, our panelists will be tackling this, and maybe Dr. Mehran's talk will be essential for us to understand. He is a professor at Georgetown University in Qatar, and he heads the Iranian Studies Unit at the Arab Center. He has many publications to his name. I remember How Islam Rules in Iran. And the floor is yours now, Dr. Mehran. شكرا جزيلا. أعتذر أولا بالحديث في اللغة الإنجليزية.
11 p.m. if I were to speak Arabic. And what I want to discuss is the dissonance between the rhetoric of Iranian foreign policy versus the reality of Iranian foreign policy, and how that has related to the Palestinian question in general, its relations with Israel, and in particular, the latest genocide that we witnessed. And one of the things that we've seen in relation to the Islamic Republic from its very establishment in 1979 is its steadfast and unstoppable support for Palestine and the Palestinian cause from the very early days up until today. But of course, that rhetorical support and the unconditional support, at times incendiary support, that, for example, we heard during the Ahmadinejad presidency, and we continue to hear by Ayatollah Khamenei, the so-called supreme leader, has really not necessarily translated into reality of Iranian foreign policy. And there are a number of reasons for it, and I wanted to discuss those reasons. And in order to do so, I thought what I would do is to first talk about some of the early principles and the rhetoric of the foreign policy of the Islamic Republic, how that rhetoric and discourse, which Adham mentioned, has come into conflict and has clashed with the realities of government, and then talk about more specifically Iran and Israel and their relations, and how this so-called axis of resistance has fit into that relationship, and what each side has done about it, and what are some of the lessons that we can draw on Iran's foreign and security policies based on its conduct, both throughout its existence, throughout the existence of the Islamic Republic, and more recently since October of 2023. When the Islamic Republic was first established back in 1979, of course it had extremely revolutionary foreign policy principles. These were things like revising the international order, spreading Islamic justice, and of course, in the context of the time, in the late 1970s, early 1980s, it meant spreading or exporting the Islamic Revolution, anti-Americanism, and of course the liberation of Palestine, which meant being anti-Israeli. And of course, we all remember that the first foreign leader who visited the Islamic Republic was Yasser Arafat, none other than Yasser Arafat. And soon, of course, these foreign policy objectives came into conflict with the realities in which Iran found itself, realities that included a devastating war with Iraq, which was the longest war of the 20th century, the need for Iran to refurbish its American-supplied army, and of course, its purchase of weapons and military hardware from Israel. So throughout the 1980s, from 83 to 85, 86, Iran purchased military hardware spare parts from Israel. And in fact, interestingly, throughout the 1980s, Israel wanted to establish relations with the Islamic Republic, and this was indirectly encouraged by the Reagan administration that viewed establishment of even indirect ties between Iran and Israel as feasible or helpful to getting American hostages in Lebanon freed. So interestingly, on the one hand, Iran was advocating for the liberation of Palestine and engaging in very harsh rhetoric against Israel, while on the other hand, it was from early on purchasing weapons from Israel. Now, of course, you remember that back in 1988, 89, Khomeini died, and then he was replaced, or he was succeeded by Khamenei. And Khamenei's foreign policy objectives have been summed up in what Khamenei says are three overriding principles. Those are Izzat, Hikmat, and Maslahat. Dignity, wisdom, and expediency. The third one is kind of quite interesting and ironic, paradoxical. Expediency. And a lot of things can be justified under expediency. Now, sometime in the 1980s, Iran's rhetoric of resistance turned into what the Iranian government called the jihad of resistance, not just a rhetoric or slogans of resistance. And this jihad of resistance resulted in what Iran assumed, Iranian political leaders assumed, was their leadership of an anti-Israeli front. There were three key actors in this anti-Israeli front insofar as Tehran was concerned, insofar as Iranian foreign policy was concerned. First and foremost, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which from the earliest days had very closely aligned itself ideologically, interestingly, with the Islamic Republic. Second, Hezbollah, about whom we just heard. And third, Hamas, later on Hamas. And of all these three groups, the Islamic Republic's relationship with Hamas was the most problematic, because when the Arab Spring uprisings occurred and when the Islamic Republic wholeheartedly supported Bashar Assad, Hamas, which had drawn close to Iran, completely cut off relations with Iran. And relations kind of became extremely cold. Interestingly, in February of 2011, Ismail Haniyeh had taken part in the anniversary of the revolution in Tehran, and then by March, both Haniyeh and March of 2011, Haniyeh and others were making anti-Iran declarations. And from 2011 until 2014, Iran's relationship with Hamas was adversarial, not just non-existent, but actually adversarial. By 2014, Hamas's circumstances had changed. It started sending out feelers to Tehran, and the relationships were reestablished once again. And those relationships were both rhetorical as well as logistic in terms of financial resources. And later on, Iran said that it had given Hamas some missile technology, and Hamas itself said it had had some missile technology. Now, Iran, I just want to mention in the form of a footnote, saw this relationship as one of leadership, that Iran was, because of its position, because of its resources, its ideological as well as material resources, was in a position of leadership of this so-called, what came to be known as axis of resistance, or initially its anti-Israeli front. And it saw these groups, particularly Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah, as sources of deterrence against a potential Israeli attack. What was perceived by Tehran as leadership was perceived by particularly Arab countries as Iranian hegemony, and Islamic Republic's hegemonic leadership. And we heard these refrains that Iran was controlling all these Arab capitals, 3 or 4 Arab capitals, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, Israel was not sitting quiet by itself. What Iran perceived as sources of deterrence, Israel perceived as grave threats. Whether or not those threats were strategically capable of doing anything, Israel perceived them as grave threats. And Israel came out with the concept of getting rid of the octopus, saw Iran as the octopus and its various proxy groups, its various non-state actors as the arms, and decided one by one not only to eliminate these arms of the octopus, but to go for the head. And this kind of going for the head had been an non-declared Israeli policy since 2013, but the whole octopus doctrine came into being in 2022 when Israel started a series of assassinations inside Iran and attacks on port facilities, cyber attacks inside Iran, and what had started out as kind of a rhetorical conflict between Iran and Israel had by the 2000s become an actual Cold War between Iran and Israel. And of course, the so-called axis of resistance was not sitting quiet, and this was a typical case of, as Dr. Adham mentioned, kind of rhetoric. Rhetoric was no longer just rhetoric and discourse. It had become strategic. Now, as part of going after the octopus, Israel kept attacking Iranian proxy groups. It kept attacking Syria, the Syrian government under Bashar Assad, and it kept attacking, of course, these kind of cat strikes or low-intensity warfare against Hezbollah in particular, but also Hamas. By the 2020s, an interesting development happens. There was tremendous pressure inside Iran as to why, despite the rhetoric, is the government not doing anything about Israeli attacks? That Israel was attacking with complete impunity, and all the Iranian government was doing was kind of denouncing. And there was a lot of chatter, actual discussions, and also policy debates within Tehran. Why is Iran sitting quiet in the face of continued Israeli attacks? And one of the discussions was Iran is spending all this money in Syria, and it is sacrificing all these soldiers and all these so-called advisors in Syria, and the Iranian government isn't doing anything about it. And the Iranian government kept saying that this is part of a doctrine of strategic patience. But strategic patience was only eroding the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic further and making it look indecisive or weak. So by the late 2020s or 2022, there was a great deal of pressure on the Iranian government to respond. And interestingly, when the genocide started, the government didn't do anything. It simply continued to denounce Israel. And it simply kept up its rhetorical denunciations of Netanyahu and the Zionist entity. It still didn't do anything about the Palestinian cause. Only when Iranian consulate in Damascus was attacked did the government change officially its policy of strategic patience and engaged in what it said was strategic messaging to Israel, and engaged in, again, these are all buzzwords that the government used, strategic messaging and proportionate response in April of 2003. And interestingly, when Ismail Haniyeh was killed in Iran during the swearing in and the inauguration of Masoud Pezeshkian as the president, it took Iran still a month to respond. And so it didn't respond, and it declared that, okay, strategic patience is over, and now we're going to attack. And of course, we all know the history of the attack between Iran and Israel. What are some of the lessons that we can draw based on this kind of going back and forth between Iran and Israel? First of all, like all states, there's a dissonance between the rhetoric of Iranian foreign policy and the reality of Iranian foreign policy. Very few leaders are as honest as Donald Trump in declaring, I have colonial intentions. And I'm going to invade here, and I'm going to take this and take that. Most often, leaders are more like Biden. They talk about grand rhetoric of human rights and at the same time support genocide. And that same kind of duplicity, but in a very different sense, applies also to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran's strategic culture is far more conservative than is commonly assumed, because the assumption is that the bombastic rhetoric coming out of Tehran will then translate into Iranian aggressive foreign policy, and that, of course, has not necessarily been the case. Iran, of course, has officially declared an end to its policy of strategic patience, and at the same time, as we've just heard, the so-called axis of resistance is no longer in existence. And so Iran's deterrent strategy has now shifted from reliance on the so-called axis of resistance to greater reliance on its ballistic missiles. And interestingly, over the last month or so, the Iranians have been making a very big deal about their ballistic capabilities as well as their naval capabilities. They've always done this, but now there's an even renewed effort and reinvigorated effort. And interestingly, as the last sentence, there is now a balance of terror between Iran and Israel that keeps them at bay. Probably we have seen that Israel is the strongest of the two, but I think it's fair to say that both sides fear the other one. And both sides fear of the attack that, or the damage that the other one can inflict on the other. So it may no longer be deterrence through reliance on access of resistance, but it's now deterrence through a balance of terror between the two countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mehran.
The third speaker is Professor Ali Muhammad Al-Dahab. He is a retired dean and a Yemeni researcher who is specialized in security and strategic affairs. He has a PhD in philosophy, navy and environmental safety. His research focuses on security and armed conflicts. He has authored on traditional security threats and study in developing strategies of development. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Let us start quickly since we don't have lots of time. First, my greetings to the center and its leadership for this forum and for having me. This is the third time I have participated in this forum. When we talk about the title of the research paper, which is the strategic value of the Houthis' military role in supporting Gaza, we think of the concept of strategy, which we do not mention enough, because here we're not talking about the strategy that means in military terms the art of using tools and forces to achieve your goals. No, we're talking about the value, about the quantity, and this quantity is difficult to measure in empirical, non-quantitative methods. And this term, in this term, when we talk about Houthis here, we talk about Ansarullah group, which started calling itself as that in 2004, and Yemenis started calling it the Houthis, and people started calling them Houthis. And this name does not mean that they are a tribe. There's a Western understanding that this is a tribe that suffered from racial persecution. But no, they were called Houthis after the founder, Badruddin al-Houthi, who was killed in confrontations with the government in 2004. And he was born in the area of Houth in Amran district. His father and his grandfather are from the governorate of Houth, and he moved to Saada. His grandparents moved into Saada. However, they say that they are descendants of the Hashemites, the Husseins. And so the Houthis were involved in the axis of resistance supported by Iran since their establishment. And they were supported with training and weapons, and they had to participate in any violent confrontation in the region as part of this axis. And I do not believe that they had the capability of involving themselves in the Gaza war had they not had the arming and the weaponry force that could have made a difference. So these Houthis that came from the mountains, that they have factories of weapons, that they have military experts, they are novices, and they are warriors in a country. They did not have enough weapons. They overthrew the government in September 2007. So the strategic value that we are talking about in the participation of the Houthis in Gaza and supporting the resistance brigades in Gaza, it's their attacks in the sea and on land made pressure that achieved some goals. What are the goals? They announced quite honestly that their goals was to stop the Israeli aggression on Gaza and to stop the siege on Gaza. And then these demands developed, or these conditions for stopping their attacks on land and in the sea developed into stopping the aggression against Lebanon. And this indicates that there is a party in this confrontation, and this party in the future will have a role. And so there's an indication that this is related to the Islamic brigades in Iraq. And perhaps until now there is political containment, but we may have a breakage of violence at any moment because they believe that they are the gatekeeping or guards of the ceasefire in Gaza. And so At any rate, how did the role of Houthis start in these circumstances? Yemen was going through a political settlement, which is the humanitarian truce, and humanitarian is between quotation marks, a humanitarian truce that was signed and announced in Riyadh, supported by the UN in March 2021. And this truce represented an entrance for the peace process, and it indicates the construction of the measures of trust, releasing prisoners, opening roads. However, this truce faced problems when the Houthis refused to sign the extension, and thus there were some concessions inside the Yemeni government, which is internationally recognized. The community felt like there are some implications for this truce, and so they did not feel like the Houthis had the right to escape or not uphold the terms of this truce, such as opening the roads, because everyone now is being paid by the citizens. So the government, by the Houthis, has no duty whatsoever. It does not pay anything from the treasury of their authority. The electricity is being paid for, transportation, medicine, education, everything has become a commodity that cannot be afforded by the impoverished people. And so there was a controversy and sometimes protests in some governorates against them. And then Al-Aqsa flood came as an exit and as a pretext for them. And they said this is a divine war that shows them as national heroes, meaning that they are playing a national or nationalist hero in an arena that had great deal of inaction. And the storage, the warehouses, the Arab warehouses were filled with unused weapons. And so the Houthis seemed to simple people as nationalists who are strong and who were defending Gaza. And so many media institutions and platforms and influencers depicted them in this light, without looking into the political dimensions of their involvement, because there aren't only domestic factors to their involvement. There were also regional and international factors that helped them to receive lots of support, training, and weapons, and exchange of information at various levels with the various partners. They came in 10 years, controlled the country, and they had a huge amount of information that tell them how the ships move from a country to another, from continent to another. This indicates that there is an international network that benefits from this and that gives them information. And of course, in wars, information is power. And so this information for them is the first evidence for achieving their targets. How did the Galaxy Leader move? It was a commercial ship. When they started targeting ships, they targeted commercial ships that had no security or guards. These ships do not have weaponized protection mechanisms. And so this is where the security institutions started being established to protect these ships. So they control the Galaxy Leader ship, and it wasn't hijacked as if as it was depicted by the media. They brought 3 helicopters in cooperation with Iran and local experts to return this ship into service. So they controlled this Galaxy Leader ship, and 3 days later they created a dramatic scene where they showed that there were parachutes going into the ship that came from Turkey. They photographed this scene as if there were parachutes, people in parachutes going into the ship, even though this ship was in the sand by now. And so they also released the people, the sailors of the ship, and they honored them. Then why are you honoring them after you've kidnapped them and you said that they were cooperating with the Zionist entity? They gave them certificates of honor and they released them, and there was an initiative by Sultanate of Oman. Anyway, we cannot hide or we cannot ignore how the Yemenis got the supersonic missiles. A handful of countries only has the supersonic missiles, and they are incredibly dangerous. This means that there is a party that is hidden that supports these parties in the Red Sea, which is a very sensitive area for security because there is a flow of oil there. It is close to Israel, the first ally of the West in the Middle East. At the same time, China was accused of paying the Houthis and giving them training programs and weapons and playing a mediation role with Iran to bring these weapons. And they want to retaliate against the West and also Russia is taking part of that because they want to retaliate against the West for what is happening in Ukraine. So they thus we noticed that these supersonic missiles appeared in the war when they started showing them in June, and then in September until October until November they gradually started using them more and more. In September, there were several attacks using these missiles. And though this is a chronology of what is happening along with what was happening in Lebanon. And so this focus of the crisis moved from Lebanon into Yemen with the Houthis, and this brought on several international risks. It diverted the attention to this area where there's oil flow and religious conflicts and political conflicts in the area. And there was also a Shiite East African crescent in the area, and there is also the head of this Eastern Shiite crescent will start in Saada and end in Yemen. So it will start with the Yemenis. And at the same time, there was intense military existence in the Red Sea. And as you know, this caused the sensitivities for several countries who perceived the Red Sea as an Arab territory, specifically Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Egypt was damaged, suffered great damages due to that, and they announced that they had great losses because the Suez Channel no longer brought to them profits as before. And so this was the role of the Houthis. And here we ask the missiles that are being launched against commercial ships, couldn't they be launched against warships? You could say that warships have protection, but why didn't they launch these missiles against ships that were protecting the commercial ships? They came to protect your enemies, your hypothetical enemies. The Speeders operation, which was executed by the EU in February 2024, and they allied with the UK and implemented Poseidon, the Poseidon Arrow operation as well. At the same time, in this paper might raise lots of controversy, but this is not about any bias. It's about the implications. Of course, we thank them for their participation, their involvement, because they broke the state of silence in the Arab regimes, but they paid a hefty price. Why? Because they jumped into a battle where they couldn't defend themselves against the violent response against it. There's over 100,000 killed, Yemenis killed by the attacks, and great damages in Al Hudaydah port, and 3 power producing plants were damaged, and not one defense missile was launched. They have missiles that were given to them, and they are administered in a way or another that do not make any strategic impact in the region. So why are these missiles making impact in Baqiq and Harith in 2019 and drove Saudi Arabia to start the peace process, and did not make the same impact in the Red Sea or Israel or the occupied territories? This is the question that we are asking. Is it because the missiles that were given to them did not have the full capacity of their explosion, explosion capacity? One of them fell in a school, one of them broke a window. Yes, they created some tension and psychological, moral tension in the Israeli community and in the army about the their defense mechanism, and the fact that they are not able to defend themselves against these missiles, and that created the economy of missiles and exhausted the capacities of the defense mechanism systems in Israel. Because when you are facing an offensive missiles that cost 3,000 or 10,000 USD, you defend yourself with 3 missiles in this iron by this iron dome or the David catapult. And these missiles created a gap in the defense mechanism. But here, we shouldn't belittle their role. However, the strategic value is really limited, and we indicated in our previous approaches that these missiles did not make an impact that achieves your political will, power, such as the abduction of the ship, which was actually a Saudi floating hospital. They hijacked it and took it into their territories. And so why didn't this make impact the same way it made an impact when they attacked the Saudi airport in Riyadh and other Saudi facilities? So there is a psychological impact of these attacks. The Houthis depicted themselves as heroes, and it benefited them because of the weak stance of the government, of the Yemeni government. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ali. Our final speaker is Dr. Marwan Kabalan. He is the head of the Political Studies Unit at the Arab Center and the Executive Master's Program at the Doha Institute, and he is a member of the board of directors of the Conflict Center. He'll be speaking on Syria. I'm sure many of you eagerly await to hear this about the Syrian position regarding the war on Gaza. It has been very confusing indeed, to say the least. And if it wasn't for Bashar al-Assad's adoption of a policy of remaining idle, every time I speak about this, I find no problems in saying that the Palestinian cause is a Syrian cause. This may sound emotional, but this is a political, social, historical fact, and both Palestine and Syria are part and parcel of one entity. When we go back to 1864, it was the last time when Jerusalem was part of the Damascus Vilayet in the Ottoman days, and then later on Jerusalem was separated, and because of the intervention of European powers in the affairs of the Eastern Christian minorities, and also the separation of Lebanon in the same manner, and the first parliament in Syria, Greater Syria, after the demise of the Ottoman Empire, had a large presence of Palestinians. Hashim al-Attasi headed, or was the Speaker of the Parliament. He became later on President, and the main item on the agenda of that conference was to discuss the idea of the attempts, in fact, of establishing a Jewish entity in Palestine, and I quote here that they rejected this proposal and the separation of Palestine and Lebanon from Greater Syria, and also a proposal in this effect was made to the Paris Conference to discuss the future of Arab countries after the Ottoman Empire's Arab territories. I don't want to delve into these details, but when it comes to the Syria's relations with the Palestinian cause, we can talk about 5 phases. First, after the Nakba of 48 and the recognition of the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, this lasted for about quarter of a century, and it's so an unconditional support by Syria because it's a pan-Arabist cause, similarly to the Golan Heights, and the Syrian parliament passed the decree 260 in 1960s, which gave the Palestinians all the full citizenship rights, similarly to Syrians in Syria. This lasted till the end of the 60s. At the end of the 60s, the Palestinian cause became part of the power struggle in Syria. In this period, there was an inner struggle between the different factions of the Ba'ath regime, between Hafez al-Assad and Salah al-Jadid, and we know how in the 70s or early 70s the Syrian army wanted to interfere in Jordan, and before that the Arab Ba'ath Party adopted the policy or the doctrine of popular resistance as a path to liberating Palestine, and allowed for the Fatah movement to open training camps, and Khalil al-Wazir, a famous leader of Fatah, moved to Syria, and then this culminated in 1970 when there was an attempt to send the Syrian army to interfere in Jordan. This was part and parcel of the power struggle in Syria, and of course this attempt ended in the defeat of the Syrian army. The second phase was the struggle over the decision making in the Palestinian revolution. Since maybe the mid-70s, Hafez al-Assad tried to impose this control over the Palestinian decision making, and from 1974 till 1993, when the Oslo Agreement came into existence, and it was apparent Hafez al-Assad's regime's attempts to impose their control over the Palestinian decision, and when in 1976 Damascus interfered militarily in Lebanon, and in 1982 Israel expelled the PLO from Lebanon, and Hafez al-Assad regime continued that and expelled the PLO from Tripoli, and we know the struggle between Hafez al-Assad and the PLO, which the first phase of this tension in Syria's relations with Palestine, and the Syrian army even opened fire on Palestinian freedom fighters, and this all paved the way for a new phase of separating the pathways when the PLO signed the Oslo agreements, and Syria entered into direct negotiations with Israel to reach a peace agreement, which almost was signed, and but the assassination of Rabin in 1995 ended that. Of course, when Bashar al-Assad came to power, he wanted to start his own legitimacy, and there is no better way than adopting the rhetoric of resistance, and he only got power because his father passed away and he had no legitimacy. This phase lasted for about 10 years, from 2001 till 2011. During this period, and the relations with Hamas strengthened, especially after Hamas was expelled from Jordan, and the Syrian regime started supporting Hamas with weapons and other forms of support. The latter phase came during the period from 2011 to 2024, with the demise of the Bashar al-Assad regime, when the Syrian regime, for all intents and purposes, turned its back on the war on Gaza. And of course, Hamas in 2012 took a clear position vis-à-vis the Arab Spring, and Hamas's cadres in the Palestinian refugee camps in Damascus took a clear stand of siding with the revolutionaries, which pushed the regime to take very strong and vicious positions against Hamas, and the regime never forgave Hamas until later on, due to Iranian pressure with Damascus, with Hamas. But 6 months later, in his famous interview with Sky News, Bashar al-Assad accused Hamas clearly of acting against his country, more or less, and he says that at any moment, if the Palestinian cause clashes with the national interests of Syria, then let the Palestinian cause go to hell. So this is basically a very clear position and a complete turning point in the relations of Damascus vis-à-vis the Palestinian cause. So the struggle or the war in Gaza, the position of the regime was clear, and because of Hamas's position. But when the war on Lebanon came, people's expectations were different, because they expected that since Hezbollah interfered on the side of the regime in Al-Qasr and the other Syrian towns and fought on the side of the regime, people started raising questions. What will the regime do? Will they return the favor and side with Hezbollah or not? There are certain elements we should take into consideration. Since into 2018, and the regime took back about 60% of the territories with the help of Russians, and this deluded the regime into thinking that it came up victorious in the struggle against the opposition. Of course, it did not realize that it was due to the help of his allies, but he did not realize that the allies who helped in their ability to continue supporting him due to economic reasons and others were no longer able to do so. So he started laying down bridges with the Gulf countries, specifically the UAE and Saudi Arabia. This kind of openness from certain Arab regimes to the Bashar al-Assad regime reflected some sort of a double standards on behalf of Bashar al-Assad with Iran and its proxies on the one hand and Arab countries, especially the Gulf countries, until the last moments of his regime's life. Bashar al-Assad was thinking that maybe his calculations was not much different than that of Hezbollah's after the 2006, that the achievements of that war would help Hezbollah and also of course Bashar al-Assad to achieve some strategic objectives, because this relationship with his allies kept him alive and caused the survival of his regime, and he would resume his relations with Arab countries, although he did not fulfill any of the conditions from the Arab countries, and there were some sort of a reconciliation with Lebanon and Arab countries, but he didn't show any signs of concessions, and he kept his relations with Iran. Yet in the last months, when it became apparent almost that Israel has taken the decision in coordination with the United States to expel Iran from the region, and Israel intensified its attacks, and maybe Bashar al-Assad maybe began to realize that maybe he can give up on his relationship with Iran. Maybe he made the same calculations like Hassan Nasrallah did, that Israel wouldn't dare attack him, and he thought that Israel would continue the same rules of engagement which Israel followed for a long time. But the problem is, when Israel decided not to stick to these rules of engagement, I think the same dilemma faced Hassan Nasrallah, and the turning point was the assassination of Fuad Shukr, in my opinion, and not Hassan Nasrallah. I think it became apparent that Israel is no longer following the same rules of engagement, and maybe the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah made Bashar al-Assad realize the reality of the situation, and 3 days later his own brother was the subject of an assassination attempt, and he started exchanging messages with some Gulf countries showing his willingness to sort of keep a distance with his traditional alliances with Iran, but I think that was too late in the day, and the withdrawals from Aleppo, Idlib, and other areas, and the strikes against Iranian militias eventually led to the final demise of this. I think the idea was the focus on what the regime did, but nobody focused enough attention on the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the Shara, movement and what they were doing. Maybe this was the unintended consequence of what Israel was doing for more than 1 year, whether in Lebanon or Syria, and attacking these Iranian militias. One final point. Maybe Bashar al-Assad didn't notice that in Iran there was a new government by Pezeshkian and Jawad Zarif when he went to the UN, and there was some sort of a new debate in Iran whether Iran is really prepared to go into war for the sake of any of its allies or not, and because maybe Iran was no longer in a position to provide the same sort of support. And we know the Iranian statement by saying that we are not going to fight on behalf of an army which does not have the will to fight for itself. Now, the new regime in Syria is raising the slogan of Syria first, and these people mean what they are saying, and by that they mean that they should focus on Syria, and all our efforts should focus on Syrian internal affairs and no longer pay attention to the pan-nationalist or pan-Arabist slogans. I think they really need to revisit history and geography, because if there is any Syrian who looks forward to Syria resuming its role in the Arab world, Syria cannot do that except through the gateway of the Palestinian cause, because that is the only way for Syria to play such role, and for the reasons that we mentioned, Syria will remain at the heart of the struggle for the Palestinian cause. This is not an ideological stance. This is a historic and geographical necessity, and thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marwan. Thank you to all the speakers for committing to the time allotted to you. We have half an hour. We can have 15 to 20 minutes for questions. And can we not have remarks that are too lengthy? To make more time for questions. Thank you very much, Dr. Mehran. Is it possible to accept this theoretical conception of what had happened and what was happening in the region over the 30 past years, that there was a process of a war between Iran and Israel that is similar to the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians? The essence of the peace between Israelis and Palestinians over the past 30 years was the peace that had never happened, and the process remained in this. And in this process, Israel accomplished many achievements, proving their image in the world, US support, normalization later on, and then war at the regional level between Iran and Israel. Its essence is a war that didn't happen and will not happen, but on its margins there are procedures that include supporting Islamist movements, Hezbollah and Hamas, and so on and so forth, to maintain this process. But in essence, there is no war, because it is not in the interest of Israel or Iran. Israel maintains the process of a war via which it can get more support and claim that it has an existential threat that necessitates continuous support from the US. And Iran, in this process, benefits by spreading its forces, its power in the region, in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, and so on and so forth. But the war itself does not happen. What we see here, the collapse of the axis of resistance, is details of the process of a war. But the war didn't happen and will not happen before Israel achieves its last accomplishment, which is normalization. Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries using the Iranian scarecrow, which it claims it's an existential threat to it. Good evening. I am confused. I don't know, especially that we have we listen to the elite of professors. You describe these states not as fronts of support to Gaza. Some descriptions by the professors, especially our colleague from Yemen, is belittling the roles of these countries or connecting them to specific goals or goals that are not related to this war. This is my observation. The other issue that I would like to comment on, the paper about Hezbollah. Did they involve themselves in the region, or they were forced to be involved? Because Julani, they don't just have Kalashnikovs. No, they are carrying weapons that are being dropped from airplanes. And the last thing I would like to extend my greetings to our colleague who spoke about Syria for his objectivity. He concluded with the issue of exiting the crisis by dealing with the issue of Israel. And the other remark, he admitted and recognized, which is very important, he recognized that there was interference, unacceptable interference in the Syrian revolution from various individuals. And this is what all I wanted to say. Thank you. Thank you very much for the professors for this enriching session. Dr. Adham, I would like to comment on Hezbollah and its interference. Let us agree that Hezbollah did not want this war, and moreover, the war for them was a trap, or they were cornered, and they interfered at the minimum level. And the most important question that we need to ask is, why did they interfere at the minimum level? And I am not enthusiastic about the ideological interpretation. I believe that the main factor, in my personal opinion, let us say, is that the trouble of the legitimacy of their weapons. Hezbollah, since 2000, since the liberation, kept weapons that were outside the framework of the state. So a spark of a country inside a country, a state inside a state, that was not justified. If they hadn't interfered at the minimum level, they would not have been able to justify why they kept their weapons throughout all this time, especially to the other Lebanese components. A state inside a state. And so gradually they thought that this is a model that they could explore. Hezbollah, this is something that few people talk about. They interfered in Iraq, starting with Ali Musa Daqdouk and Al-Kawtharaniya. Hezbollah, in my estimation, was a tool for constructing the Iranian domination in Iraq, a tool for the militia ruling. And when we talk about this, I do not exaggerate. I will finish quickly, Dr. Harith. I do not exaggerate when you hear the sentence Hezbollah was involved in the issues of the region. Of course, Hezbollah, yes, it's involved, but it is not an independent actor. On one hand, we cannot understand Hezbollah without understanding its role as a tool. Not saying it's necessarily an Iranian tool, it is a tool in an axis, and its interference in Iraq was due to it being a tool of Iran. And so why is Iraq important for Hezbollah? In all of your remarks, Dr. Adham, you did not use the term Shiites and spreading Shiism. In Iraq, Hezbollah was a Shiism actor for the power and the reign of Shiites and its superiority to the nationalist identity in Iraq. Thank you. Ask your question, please, and then we will move on to the next speaker. Hello. I have a question to Mr. Adham about Lebanon, referring to the factors that contributed to Hezbollah's latest loss, the hijacking, the pagers, and so on and so forth. Do you not think that Hezbollah working on the strategic patience throughout war, before the assassination and even after the assassination of Fuad Shukr, was the hair that broke the camel's back? And how do you explain the status of being completely frozen vis-a-vis Israel's plans to go into war? They could have been precautionary. They could have dealt some strikes and not wait for Israel to come and attack them. It was obvious that that was their next step. Mr. Ali, thank you for your remarks. However, allow me, most of your remarks was against or anti-Houthis, regardless of me being Palestinians. I don't know who the Houthis are and what their religion exactly is. However, they stood with us as Palestinians. And more importantly, if they have personal gains from closing the Red Sea, why did they form alliances to stop them and stand against them? And there were Israeli and British airstrikes, and now they connected their stopping of their operations to the ceasefire in Gaza. And also regarding Syria and Syria first motto, this is not just in Syria internally, domestically. It was said by the Minister of Foreign Affairs lately. And so in light of the military, the Israeli military forces going into Syria, what are the anticipated steps in the future, and what formulates the relationships between them and the Syrian leadership? Because it might be years before we have a presidential election in Syria. Thank you. أنا أعتذر، سوف أطرح سؤالي باللغة الإنجليزية لك دكتور أدهم.
Assessment that Hezbollah's entry into this war was in part motivated by its desire to have leverage in order to push for its own candidate in the Lebanese presidential election. So to push for Salman Frangieh to be president of Lebanon, which obviously failed.
شكرا على
for the valuable remarks, Dr. Adham. First, I am really happy with the content that you presented. To what extent did Hezbollah's interference affect the war in Syria? This is important because it is not only psychological formation of an enemy. It is also preparation for confrontation with Israel. There is difference between mobilizing people psychologically. This wouldn't serve you in a real tangible confrontation. Why didn't Hezbollah use its force, its destructive missile-based force against Israel? From my readings of what was published in Israel about the destructive ability of Hezbollah, they say they have over 150,000 missiles, and 10,000 of those are highly accurate missiles that can reach over 500 kilometers. Why didn't they use them? Is it because that Iran did not desire that? And is it because Israel really destroyed these weapons, or is it because they feared the reaction by Israel against them and they didn't know? The leadership of Hezbollah, they hadn't realized that an all-out war had started. It had started and they hadn't realized it. And so to what extent is Hezbollah, this leads us to this question, to what extent did they wage the war of 2023-2024 with the mindset of the 2006 war? Many military and political leaders wage wars, not the upcoming wars, but the past wars. So to what extent did Hezbollah do that when Israel started assassinating leaders? I was saying next week they'll kill Hassan Nasrallah. I'd expected that. To what extent were they unaware? The leadership was unaware. So for my friend Marwan, for Syria, and thank you for your valuable presentation. But there are simple things that do not need to be explained. The Syrian regime, for Hafez al-Assad or Bashar al-Assad, they have strategic stability in not confronting Israel. This is a strategy that they did not deviate from at any moment in time. When they bombed them in 2008, no, it was 2007, they bombed the nuclear reactor facilities, and they bombed Damascus several times, and they killed a nuclear scientist on a beach in 2008. They did not respond. And not only that, in the recent time, this is something I would have liked you to focus on or to highlight. When Israel and there was humiliation for the Syrian identity because Israel took its whole liberty in the Syrian territories. They started bombing, and there were doubts with actual base that he is showing Israel where to bomb. And Iran had its doubts about that as well, and there were doubts with Hezbollah as well. And so this was a perspective that should have been discussed. So let us keep it short, please, so we can answer all questions. So in the Middle East, there were 3 projects before the 7th of October: the Israeli project, the Iranian project, and the Turkish project. And the 4 presentations discussed the collapse or the weakening of the Iranian project. So what about the Turkish-Israeli confrontation, possible Israeli-Turkish confrontation in Syria? And is there some sort of agreement between the 2 parties about this? And also, the collapse of this axis that was concerning Israel, and if they have a goal entitled Palestine, does this pave the way in front of the occupation and Netanyahu about the new new Middle East, where Israel will take a leading role and be the primary decision maker, especially that the confrontation with Turkey is not likely because Turkey is part of the NATO organization. And is the change in Syria with the Islamist political movement leading the regime after the collapse of the previous regime, will it affect the Islamist resistance-based movements into the dawah-based movements focusing on the domestic situation, especially that we have noticed no serious reactions towards great occupations 25 kilometers into the Syrian borders by Israeli tanks, and there are no horizons about the achievement of a state of citizenship, democracy, and human rights, which was the aspiration of the Syrian citizens. Thank you. I had a question, and Mr. Mahmoud included some of my questions. I believe that there were poor estimation by Hezbollah, especially after the assassination of Al-Aruri. And I believe my colleague mentioned the other remarks I had. I have two quick remarks. First, regarding Lebanon, I believe that Hezbollah, what killed Hezbollah was Bashar al-Assad regime and Iran al-Assad regime, because Hezbollah thought that this regime can defend itself, and then they found out that they are unable to defend themselves, and so Hezbollah cannot at all fight on two fronts, in Syria and also in the south of Lebanon, and so this was a suicide. The other suicide was by Iran, which was dominating the decisions and telling them to do or not to do, and so they were never autonomous or could never take decisions about their war with Israel. And we all know that Iran does not want to fight. So about the research paper about Yemen, to be honest, Dr. Ali gave me a heart attack. I cannot believe this. It's just a bunch of Houthis did all of that, and Britain, France, US, 155 military ships surrounding Yemen, and they stopped Eilat, and they are bankrupt, and the prices of shipping around the world are skyrocketing. And is it possible what you said? Is this all possible? A question and not a long remark, please. Last, final question. Amjad, my question specifically, did Hamas confuse everyone's strategies without them having a strategy? And the other important question, the non-state actors, are they on the way to turning into states using the model of Hamas and Tahrir al-Sham? And also, the movement of Houthis is valuable because others did not move. If Egypt had made a move, then the Houthis did not have any movement of value. Now, this time it's the final question, I promise. Hello. We have Yemeni, Lebanese, and Iranian, and the Syrian. Is it by coincidence or not? But it's important. I could not discern you. You're Iraqi. I thought you were Iraqi. They said no. First, I would like to ask Mr. Ali. First, thank you for the presentation. I disagree with you personally, but you indicated something that is very important, the start of the formation of the Shiite crescent in Somalia and until Kenya. And it is true, I read about that. But on the other hand, which is very important, I'm sure you are aware, it is deeper than that in Somalia. There is also an Israeli Gulf Turkish formations in Somalia, and something that is called the Gold Somalia Al-Dhahabi. I do not remember what it's called. So my question, Dr. Mehran said that Israel and Iran are afraid of each other or are terrorized of each other about the war that is to happen. So is it also weakness? The weakness of the Iranian accent, does it mean that Iran, when they form the Shiite crescent, they are transferring their conflict with Israel and the Gulf states, specifically the UAE? Of course, there are shared interests between Israel and the UAE inside Somalia. Do they transfer that conflict to further than Israel? And my question to Dr. Adham as well, or Mr. Adham, it's not directly related to your presentation, but I heard a podcast, a serious margin. It was really deep, and my question is: are the gaps in Hezbollah, did they impede them from dominating Lebanon to govern it or change it, since they had capabilities to dominate the economics, the intelligence, and other facets? Thank you very much.
We have 10 minutes. We either continue taking questions without any answers, or I had some questions of my own, but I'm going to give the floor now. Now we start in the reverse order with Dr. Marwan. I will choose some questions to respond to because I cannot reply to all of them, and to allow, of course, time for my colleagues. Regarding Hezbollah, I'm sure Dr. Adham has other answers. In my opinion, Hezbollah miscalculated seriously. Maybe they did not realize that on the 7th of October 2023, the rules of engagement have changed. By the time Hezbollah realized that, it was too late. Hassan Nasrallah did not appreciate the tremendous change, and when he did, it was too late. In my opinion, maybe Dr. Muharib mentioned that. I think the escalation in the relations with Hezbollah, the initiative was always in the hands of the Israelis. They would dictate the rules of the engagement, and Hezbollah's threats to use his missile force to burn down the Haifa port, I think that was not the case. The Israelis did not believe that. They sort of dragged him into a trap. I don't know when he realized that, if he ever did. As for what Dr. Muharib said about the Syrian regime giving Israel information on where the Iranians were, I think the entire axis of resistance was breached so far as security is concerned, except for Hamas. Iran, Hezbollah, the Syrian regime. Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated in the heart of Tehran. Many assassinations, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, what happened in the Iranian consulate in Damascus, and others. In my personal estimation, except for Hamas, which has proven until the last minute that Israel could not even reach its own hostages, that Hamas is the only one whose security was not breached and penetrated by Israel's intelligence. So far as Turkey and Israel is concerned, yes, there is a struggle over influence by both countries in Syria. And one of the reasons why the Israeli incursion I hate the word advancement that some use in any event. The Israeli aggression, attacking the Syrian army, destroying its military arsenal. I think Israel is not assured regarding the new regime. They know now this regime doesn't have the potential, but later on, maybe they will constitute a threat. Maybe that's why they are trying to make Syria a demilitarized country. So now the Israelis think that by the time they got rid of Iran, Bashar al-Assad and all the proxies, now they have Turkey in Syria. So there are manifestations of this kind of a struggle. Israel is trying to open avenues with Qassad, the Kurdish democratic forces, northeastern of the Euphrates. This is annoying Turkey a lot and many other things. I think, yes, we will see a struggle over the influence, and the Israelis are not happy that Turkey is trying or pushing towards delineation of the borders with Syria, because this will have implications on the Eastern Mediterranean gas reserves. How far will this go? I don't know, but it's not by necessity that if Turkey is an ally of the US, this will stop any quarrels between them or Israel, because Greece is an ally of the US, and like Turkey, it's a member of the NATO. As what can be said about Israeli incursions in the Golan, it's difficult to say. They don't have the military capabilities. Israel has destroyed 80 or 85% of Syria's military. It's estimated that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has between 35,000 to 40,000 with light weaponry. They do not have the ability to enforce security and stability. You saw what happened in the eastern parts. There are areas still outside their control. Eastern Euphrates, 1/4 of the country's territory. There are some areas in the north, areas in the coastal areas. The situation is still very fragile. So if they are not yet able to exercise their full control over their territory, I think they cannot face up to Israel's challenges. This is too early in the day unless they acquire enough resources to create some sort of a deterrent force. I don't think they can do that. We have two possibilities. Either Israel has occupied new territories to negotiate over to keep the old one, like we give you back these territories and forget about Golan Heights. Or the situation would remain as it is until the balance of power changes. The Israelis are building military positions in the 400 square kilometers of the buffer zone. It was the same area which was occupied in 67, and the Syrian army liberated parts of it in 1973. So this will depend on the balance of power. Thank you, Dr. Marwan. Mr. Ali, in the name of God, the most merciful and most compassionate, when I discussed the paper with some colleagues before coming here, he said to me that you will anger two nationalities, the Palestinians and the Lebanese. And the Egyptians will be happy with you, and the Syrians will be happy with you to a certain degree. And let me say, please, no comments, let the gentleman continue what he's saying. I'm not belittling the role the Houthis played, but I try to discuss the strategic value. It is important what they're doing. There are security concerns, there is engagement, we can call it that, as experts do, with Israel. But the missiles fired on the Saudi oil installations, which led Syria to stopping the war on Yemen and engaging negotiations with the Houthis, when the same people who gave the Houthis these missiles could have added a little bit more to the warheads of the missiles which they fired on Israel to create more effect. But we don't know. At the same time, there is a lot of media attention. But can the United States and Britain annihilate the Houthis completely? Of course they can, but they use it as a pretext, similarly to what they did with ISIS. The Houthis are in a very sensitive area, and the Americans benefit from this bogey of Houthis, and they leave it for use till later. The Houthis are not a state, they are an armed entity. They took control of the state, got control of the arms arsenal, and the Arabs, despite their unwillingness to do anything, they allowed them, but they should not have engaged in this engagement, and your back is exposed. Say we as Arabs, we should enter into the fray and fight until the death, and as the Arabs traditionally say, but we have to calculate the consequences. And will this have an impact? Yes, the Houthis had an impact. Yes, I have. But they were not alone. There was the Hezbollah, there is the Iraqi resistance, but the biggest impact was created by the resistance in Gaza and their perseverance. But the Houthis are like thieves. They should be exposed. They jumped on the bandwagon. There was a question on the Shiite crescent. First of all, the Shiite crescent is East Africa. I came up with this, I coined this phrase when it was the first in 2022 to say that this Shiite crescent is a political access based on religious principles, and now it's based maybe in Somalia or Kenya, because there is a very serious route there. The same Shiite crescent which goes through Iraq and Lebanon is no less important. The distance in geographical distance will be brought closer through hypersonic ballistic missiles. So the Houthis will be supported, and these weapons were given weapon systems, but they were not allowed to create the exact effect. They will know that it was Russia who provided these missiles through Iran or China. Then the real perpetrators will be exposed.
My turn to answer. First, I want to thank Dr. Adham and Dr. Ali for taking some of the heat off of me. Usually, I'm the one who gets all the tough questions, and so I thank my co-panelists. Just very quickly to Dr. Harith, it was always evident from Iranian statements that they were quite reluctant to engage in a war. Is the war with Israel a process? I don't know, but I think it's important to remember that Iranians, both times when Israel attacked when Israel attacked Iranian consulate in Damascus and when Israel killed Haniya in Tehran. Both times Iran went to the United Nations and requested that the UN pass a resolution against Israel. And they said they presented two conditions: either the UN resolution or ceasefire. Iran would not retaliate. And neither of those happened, and so Iran retaliated. So, and Pezeshkian said this when he was in the UN. He said, we are walking into Israel's trap of a war. They didn't necessarily want a war, and they walked into a trap. And just one last thing, as my colleague Dr. Marwan mentioned, many of these resistance groups and others, they thought they were playing by the rules of the game, not realizing that Israel was making its own rules of the game, yet again.
بعتقد قال كل شيء فينا نفل هلا. لا معي اعطاني دقيقة واحدة واجاني بحدود ال 110.
I got hundreds of questions, maybe after the session. In these seminars, nobody comes out happy. Those who want to know why Hezbollah did or did not engage in the war, there are studies I published about this. And what Haidar and others have said, we think in Arab culture and Arab rhetoric that politics is always about interest, that people try to be smart and they say, yes, there are interests, but politics is also about principles and ethics also. When we deal with Hezbollah, there are some philosophical propositions that there is a rational actor involved. And Haidar, you talk about Hezbollah as a rational actor. Its aim is not to liberate Palestine, but they are trying to spread the Shiite ideology, maybe. Another one said Hezbollah entered the war to bring a president of their choosing into Lebanon. If you want to understand Hezbollah, you have to understand its ideological makeup. Iraq does not need Hezbollah to spread Shiaism, but there is the Vilayati Faqih and the groups of militias loyal to Iran, which Hezbollah is engaged with. This is a political vision, and I claim, and I can be wrong, that Hezbollah has paid the price for its political principles. It wasn't easy. They paid a hefty price for that. When in any military action, although I'm not a military expert, but there are basics. There were American warships opposite the Lebanese coast, and you're dealing with a nuclear power. Hezbollah had to reconciliate its ideological principles and its political stance, and they had to make a choice: either turn Lebanon into another Gaza, destroyed totally by Israel, or play it safer. Thank you very much, all of you.